It is the evening of Tuesday, October 18th, 1977. Kurt Nilsson is standing on a small mountain in Ångermanland in northern Sweden. It is in this very lonely place that he is about to experience something very frightening, something he will carry with him for the rest of his life. This week, I will tell two very strange stories that happened in the same place, but 9 years apart. These stories are taken from the UFO Information magazine, and it's issue number 1 of 1978. Let's start with some important information that will have bearing on this case. Kurt is a bitten radio enthusiast. Shortwave radio is at this time an exciting hobby for many people. Before the internet, with shortwave radio and a bit of luck, you could connect with other parts of the world. Despite its name, shortwave radio can bounce off the ionosphere and the ground and reach receivers on the other side of the globe. Kurt has a shortwave radio for the 27 megahertz band mounted in his car. At 7:30 on Tuesday night, he had gotten into his car, hoping to make contact with some exciting and distant place in the world. But the radio waves didn't go very far, so he decided to drive up to a mountain called Hamliden. Hamliden, with its elevated position, is a great place for shortwave radio, and for this reason, there is also a link station for radio and television there. During his trip up to the scenic lookout spot, he has contact via the radio with a radio colleague 170 kilometers to the south. When Kurt is about 400 meters from the link station, the colleague experiences heavy interference and has trouble hearing Kurt. Kurt, on the other hand, has no problem hearing his colleague. They discuss the fact that this is quite strange, because usually when there is interference, it is always in both directions. Kurt parks by the big TV mast, and because the interferences are so strong, he cuts off contact with his colleague. It is now close to 8 o'clock in the evening. Kurt gazes out over the mountain slopes that stretch out below his elevated position. He later tells investigators, "Suddenly my gaze was caught by a light bluish object, which stood adjacent to a hill down in a hollow, about 100 meters, and diagonally left from my position. I studied it in amazement and realized that it was some kind of domed machine. I had difficulty estimating its size, but would guess that it was a few meters in diameter. There were also northern lights this evening, but this was something completely different. The craft seemed to hang in the air. It was plate-like and had a dome on top. The machine itself emitted an indirect bright blue light. This light was very dim and bounded, and its glow reached an estimated 5 meters out from the object. Beyond this light sphere, it was dark." Kurt's experience becomes much stranger when he suddenly sees 3 figures looming around the craft. Kurt would later describe them as wearing space clothes, being about 1 meter tall and grayish in color. The figures are fully visible in the light from the craft. Kurt says he was shocked, but managed to calm himself a bit and turned on the car headlights to see if he could see the strange humanoids even better. To his surprise, the craft and the creatures disappeared, and the area they were in went completely dark. So he turned off the car's headlights again. Shocked and quite unable to gear into motion, Kurt stares at the spot where the glowing craft just had been. Suddenly, he sees the object and the figures in the same place again. A strong fear now grips him. He turns on the ignition and starts driving away, back the same way he came. After about 50 meters on the road leading away from Hamliden, he sees 3 figures standing in the middle of the road. Kurt is unsure if they are the same creatures he just saw alongside the craft uphill, or if they are 3 others. He says that he was under the impression that they were crossing the roadway, and he does not know if he stopped the car himself or if they made it stop. Kurt tells us that the material their costumes were made of resembled plastic. They had short white boots that were tight-fitting like gloves. The boots looked like they belonged with the rest of the suit, seamless and in one piece. Their helmets resembled an astronaut's helmet with a forward opening for the eyes. Kurt sees the creature in the center, holding what looks like a shovel. The creature rotates the shovel so that its arms are crossed. The other 2 creatures look intently at the shovel. The convex side of the shovel is now pointed at Kurt, and at the same time the car engine shuts off and the car's headlights go out. Kurt says that it goes completely black, and he thinks that this is it, and that this is his final hour. Kurt manually turns on the headlights, which are still not lit, tries to start the engine, and to his relief it starts. He backs up about 10 meters in the dark, stops the car again, and waits for about 2 minutes before turning on the headlights. The road is completely empty, and he drives home as fast as he can. Once home, Kurt tells his wife Eva about what he has been through. They discover that Kurt's wristwatch has slowed down. It says 8:30 when in fact it was 8:50 in the evening. Kurt remembers that his friend Kjell Nesland has told him about a strange experience that had occurred in the same place years back, and so he calls him. When Kurt calls Kjell, he starts off by telling him about the strange interference that foreshadowed his other strange encounter. And immediately Kjell on the other side tells him about similar troubles, and that Kjell has had severe interference on his TV this evening. Kjell had reason to worry about interference on the TV because he was the link station manager at Hemliden. Kjell Nesland's story will soon prove very interesting in comparison to Kurt's story. But we will get to that. After the phone call, Kurt goes to the kitchen where their family dog lies on the floor. Kurt is surprised when the dog that always greets him happily starts barking at him. The dog then lies down quietly in a corner of the kitchen for the rest of the evening, something that also was unusual. Kurt's wife thinks they should go back to Hemliden to see if the creatures are still there. After some persuasion, they drive together up there, but it is nothing but dark and peaceful. On the way back, still shaken, Kurt forgets to fade to low light when meeting an oncoming car. It turns out to be a police car that stops him, and Kurt explains to the two officers what he has been through that evening. These two police officers later tell the investigators from UFO Sweden that they consider Kurt to be known as a truthful person. When the investigators from UFO Sweden visited Hemliden, they made the following observations. Something had obviously been at the site. There was a dry birch tree where the craft had been seen, and on its trunk was a scratch mark deep enough to make the wood shine white, while otherwise it was undamaged. This damage was 280 centimeters above the ground. The investigators also found 2 moss piles of different species at the site. One of them was growing on the landing site and had been picked up from the ground by an unknown person. From this moss sample, someone had taken a number of individual plants from the moss. The other species does not grow on the landing site, but on the other side of the road, where the creatures were heading when Kurt came in his car and met them crossing the road. It was also found that there were footprints on the sides of the road of the following categories. Number 1, tracks of journalists and dog tracks. In other words, a reporter and a photographer who had been at the scene earlier together with Kurt and his dog. Number 2, tracks of Kurt and Eva. Number 3, tracks of small humanoids. The heel had a cross and the foot was short, wide, and strongly rounded. The heel had a size of 4 by 4 centimeters. The calculation of the size of the craft could be done on site with the observer and was estimated to have been between 5 and 5.5 meters in diameter. So if we assume that Kjell really did see creatures, what could have been the reason they were in this place? What was the purpose of the creatures landing on this location? The only thing that emerged is that they seem to have taken samples of moss and the plants that grew nearby. Investigators also found that lichen had been scraped off a birch trunk close to the landing site, exposing the underlying layer of the trunk, but only 1 meter above the ground. This scraped tree moss had disappeared without trace and was not found during the subsequent search of the area. The creatures must have moved very quickly from the place where they were first observed, by the vehicle, to the place on the road where they were observed shortly afterwards, when they stopped the car. This is assuming that they were the same creatures. For example, there could also have been 6 of them working in 2 groups. All of this, of course, raised questions, especially as investigators had to take into account that Kurt was not the only eyewitness that had encountered something unusual and unearthly at Hemliden. Remember Kurt's friend? The one he called as soon as he got back home? As I told you earlier, Kjell was the link station manager at Hemliden, a job that involved monitoring that all technical apparatuses were working as they should. Kjell tells his story as follows. It was on the evening of March 12, 1969, that I went up to the link station to start my duty at 6. When I got there, I did my usual routine check and found that everything was in order. I sat down in the kitchenette to read the evening paper I had brought with me. Suddenly alarms sound, one after the other. The alarms indicate there is some problem with the TV link, which means people in this part of Sweden will experience severe disturbances in TV broadcasts. I checked and acknowledged the alarms but couldn't find anything out of order. The alarms came back 3 or 4 times, maybe more. I went outside for a moment and realized that the weather was clear and cold, minus 20 to 25 degrees, and northern lights hung in a cascade of green. Then I went back inside and warned the dispatcher at the Sundsvall station that I had interference. I'm not sure how long these alarms lasted, but around 6:30, it was as if someone said to me, "Now you go out." It was as if I got an impulse somehow. Kjell recounts the events when he went to the door, opened it and looked out. There he was met by an amazing sight. About 15 meters from the station building lay a giant craft. He estimated the craft to be 150 meters in diameter, and it filled the depression below the transmitter building. The outermost part of the craft was just level with the ground outside the station. In this part, Kjell could see a tunnel into the object. In the tunnel it glowed a bright gray-blue light, while the rest of the craft glowed with a gray fog-like light. Inside the tunnel, Kjell could see approximately 10 individuals, which he described as follows. They were like boxes that had been sprayed with something. They resembled clouds without fixed contours and seemed to float above the ground. They were estimated to be 130 to 135 centimeters long and 30 to 40 centimeters in circumference. Kjell's first thought was to try to get to a phone to alert the police about what he had just experienced. He was about to go back in when he realized he was unable to do so. Kjell continues to recall the events in these words. "It was just a feeling I got, that I would stand and hold the door open for them. I couldn't get out of the way. I just had to stand there and witness everything." There were 7 to 8 creatures floating into the link station, and they passed me at just a few decimeters distance. I tried to touch them, but there was a force holding me back. At the same time, a feeling came over me that I should be calm because they were not dangerous. The box-like creatures did not move very fast, but floated across the floor at about the same pace as a human being walks. They did not move on their own and had no arms or legs. Kjell remembers that he could not hear any sound as they walked, nor did he notice any unusual odor. I was so affected by those creatures that I had no free will. I felt as if I was being controlled by these individuals, and I estimate that they stayed there between 5 and 10 minutes. Before the craft took off, the tunnel closed on the box-like creatures that had been sucked into the tunnel itself. It then sped off in a northerly direction, and Kjell was able to follow its trajectory, just until it disappeared out from his periphery. When the machine disappeared, so did the paralysis, and Kjell went inside and called police officer Hans Hagblad. The police officer took Kjell's account very seriously. Kjell also called the transmitter station in Sundsvall, but they only laughed at his account, and he says, "Everyone wondered if I was sober. I would therefore like to emphasize that I was both sober and in mental balance, and I was not tired. I have no further explanation for what I saw. It just happened." Afterwards, it was found that the craft had not left any imprints in the snow in the depression. The only physical evidence of this landing in 1969 was that a pine tree had had its upper part of the crown cut off. Kjell withheld the veracity of his account his entire life. These 2 extraordinary stories happened in a place that since has been called Sweden's Roswell. One cannot but wonder why these observations were made at Hamleden. If aliens visited, what made them curious about this place? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Also, there have been more mysterious sightings in the surrounding area. Stories Lost might come back to tell those stories. Want to support the show? Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. This week, I would like to say a special thank you to Manuel and Frederick, who supported the channel by buying me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com. Do you also want to support the channel's continued work? See the link in the episode description.